We also want, we want this session to be kind of a meshing of being able to do some self-thinking, some self-reflection, giving time and space for that. I know that I constantly feel like time is the thing I have the least of. We want to have you all have some time in relevant and related academic disciplines to talk about how racism, Eurocentrism, anti-racism can show up, do show up, ought to show up. And then we want to have some brief time at the end of our conversation for thinking about moving forward and making some commitments to ourselves and then closing out. So you'll hopefully hear in that a blending in this session of group conversation, using Zoom features, having the time to do some thinking, having the time to meet some new colleagues who hopefully will continue to be our colleagues beyond this morning's hour and 15-minute session. And also just ways for us to think about how we are contributors to the AU community and how we take the AU community, even in this online form, to the next level.
Do you want me to pick up here?
Yes, I would love that. Thank you.
All right. So let's start with defining anti-racist pedagogy. Anti-racism is a term that, as I was saying a moment ago, we've been hearing this term in national media in this summer of what I've been calling this racial injustice reawakening of America that we've all been bearing witness to. But anti-racist pedagogy is the art of teaching and learning, where anti-racism becomes the central framework of how you construct your instruction and how you shape the learning experiences for your student. And so with some of the reading that I've been doing on anti-racist pedagogy in higher education, I'm finding 3 core pillars of anti-racist pedagogy. One is incorporating the topics of race and inequality into course content. When this is done well, this is done explicitly, this is done within the framework of your academic discipline, and you bring in topics of race and inequality so that you can expose students to understanding where power and privilege, where marginalization, where inequities all resonate within your academic discipline's lens of seeing the world and understanding the world. Race and inequality cannot be a single lesson in a series of a 14-week semester. It needs to be meaningfully embedded throughout the entire course content. The second pillar of anti-racist pedagogy is teaching from an anti-racist pedagogical approach. I often define anti-racist pedagogy as humanizing our students. And so in this moment of where the middle part of August in the year 2020, when we are coming out of this summer of racial injustice awakenings, where we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, it means that when we teach our students, we are truly trying to focus on them as individual humans with lived experiences that surpass whatever they're planning to experience in AU for this fall semester. They have had a summer that has changed their reality, and so responding to them as humans and as individuals resonates with anti-racist pedagogical approach. Of course, it also means that we are not enacting what is called educational violence in our classrooms, that we are not enacting microaggressions, macroaggressions, that we are not holding implicit bias, that we are not framing our students with deficit thinking, that we are not allowing stereotypes and biases to be reproduced in our classrooms, that we are not calling students by words or names or phrases that harm them and hurt them and limit their educational opportunities. All of this falls under teaching from an anti-racist pedagogical approach. And then the third component of this pedagogy is that anti-racist organizing within the campus and linking our efforts to the surrounding community. When a person claims to be an anti-racist pedagogue, It goes beyond the course schedule that you're assigned by AU. Your anti-racist organizing needs to go outside of the classroom into your service, into your scholarship, into your leadership work that you do on campus. And more importantly, your anti-racist effort needs to go beyond the campus into the surrounding community. So in our area, it means making meaningful impacts into the DC metro area, not allowing your work to just situate within higher academia. So anti-racist pedagogy includes taking yourself, your work, your service, your priorities, and letting it truly change the world by starting both within your classroom, across your campus, and into the surrounding community. But then I posted this little Google sticker I found, Zoom, on this screen, because that's what we're dealing with for this next semester. How do we incorporate topics of race and inequality into our course content where Zoom becomes our mode of instruction? So we're hoping to model that for you today by facilitating this session. Teaching from an anti-racist pedagogical approach through Zoom, it requires us to humanize our students, even in these little squares where we're seeing people in Zoom. It requires us to have informal conversations with our students, asking them
I
about
thought that
how
was
they're
you
doing.
slamming the door and shit.
Nazia, maybe you can help with the mute.
Yes.
It allows us to talk with our students about how they're experiencing their day-to-day life outside of our classroom. And anti-racist pedagogy in an online space means organizing still with the limitations of COVID to be able to make the world a better place. So however we're going to envision doing that, we need to be motivated that the world still needs us, our community still needs us, and our campus community still needs us, even with these limitations of COVID. So let's not let go of the limitations of the moment, but try and use anti-racist pedagogy to teach in this moment. I'll pause there, Samantha. Don't forget to unmute yourself. You're
Thanks.
dropping knowledge.
Sorry. No, I apologize. I muted myself because I had another visit from my son. And so, yes, so I apologize. But I think that exactly is the point. I think the humanization that can live through Zoom, because we are often in our homes, in our personal spaces, like there's immense potential there, but there is also the immense side of the lack of humanity when we are just in boxes and when we're quiet participants and we're not visible participants. And so I want to encourage us both to think about that as the faculty members, staff members who are leading content and leading learning for our students this year and beyond, but also as we think about our own participation. And I also want to kind of highlight, this is why we need to start and ground ourselves in self, and why I'm constantly thinking about who am I, how am I showing up? And so this, a lot of what we are basing our conversation on today is Ibram Kendi's recent text, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so a core quote that we find in the text on page 38, it is one of the ironies of anti-racism that we must identify racially in order to identify the racial privileges and dangers of being in our bodies. And I think this is really important because I think Kendi powerfully, as he does in all of this text, speaks to this seeming hypocrisy of, in order to eliminate racism and get to a place of anti-racism, we have to continue to talk about the constructs that were created, that were created so that we could racially divide and racially categorize. And we need to own those things because they are part of the system, they are part of the water in which we all operate. And so I want to start by personally sharing that I find, as a faculty member at AU who is a white woman who has a doctorate, who has come to AU with lots and lots of privilege. I hold that privilege in a classroom, in particular in a program where we are primarily Black and Indigenous people of color are the students. And so I hold a lot of power just by being, again, the person who starts the conversation. And I often feel like I have that power in the classroom, but I don't always feel like I have that privilege in the university as an institution. I started at AU as an adjunct, and I didn't feel like I had the same privilege and power as an adjunct. I similarly don't feel like I have the same power and privilege because I'm a term line faculty member. I'm not on the tenure line at AU. And so I feel like I name this because I think we're constantly in this dance of being both in a privileged space as folks who work at AU with all of the resources, and at the same time don't always hold privilege in every situation we operate in. And I think it's important to think about that tension. But I will name in particular for those of us who are faculty and staff who lead sessions for students, they see us as the person who has significant power when we are the faculty member who is deciding if they can get into our class, if they will succeed in our class. And so there is irony there for ourselves, there's irony there for our students, and we need to humanize that. So to the point that Amara was making, we need to voice these things and make them object of our conversation and talk about them as opposed to brushing them under the surface and under the radar.
For me, I find it difficult to identify racially in front of my students and in front of colleagues, because in this world and in this national time that I'm existing in, anti-Muslim sentiment is real and can be enacted in different ways, professionally and socially and personally. And I find that showing up in a space with my hair covered, I am recognized as a Muslim woman first, and my racial identities become obscured. I'm not often invited into spaces as an African-American woman until this summer. And now this summer, I have been seen and regarded and recognized as an African-American woman, and my Muslim identity may or may not show up in those conversations at the same time. And I often speak with my students in class about intersectionalities and what it means to hold multiple identities that each involve different social positions and social experiences, both on campus and in our larger world. But as difficult as it is for me to show up with all of my identities verbally in my classroom, I'm consistently motivated when I look at the faces of my students and I see their complexities and that they need me to start the conversation so that at some point in our society, it will be easier for them to show up with all of their complexities in their respective situations, wherever they see themselves.
I appreciate that, Amara. I think it's where I feel like we need to all be leaning in to the extent that we can to like speaking the unspeakable. And I feel like as a white woman with immense power and privilege, I feel like it is often my responsibility to name those things, especially in settings where I'm in the majority and in settings when I'm in the minority. And I think it creates and opens doors that I think we don't tend to open. And I would say, I think we don't tend to open them even more so in the online space as we all continue to build our acclimation and comfort in the online space. So we want to give you all some time. As we are describing, our faculty identities are not static. I'm just noticing a typo, my apologies. We possess privileged and oppressed identities. Our socialization and intersectional identities impact our teaching, our research, our university and community work. So we want to give you about 10 minutes and we'll be mindful of the clock. It might be a little bit less.
About 5.
Thanks,
We said
yes.
5. Yes.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not looking at the clock because it's hidden because my screen is being shared. So thank you. What social positions do you hold? What intersecting identities do you possess? And how do these impact your work at AU with students, colleagues, community partners? We're not going to ask you to share exactly how you're reflecting. If you're a writer, write. If you're a thinker, please get lost in your thoughts. We're going to just hold silence for the next 5 minutes. And then we will come back together and we'll actually break out into breakout groups to have a conversation related to this, but not where we're asking you to share anything you're not interested and willing to share. So let's take 5 minutes for quiet reflection. We'll leave the questions here on the screen. So take about 2 more minutes, and a really important question has come up, which is just how do you define position? And I would say I define it really broadly. What are the social positions you hold relative to your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your class, the title and job you hold? So I would just think about that. And let's take 2 more minutes before we come back together. And I'm going to ask you to wrap up that thought. And so I appreciate everyone's willingness to dive in and start thinking. What we're going to do is we're going to transition to some breakout groups in a moment. So I'm going to ask you a couple of things. I'm going to ask you first, I know we've made this announcement a couple of times, so bear with us. If you don't have your full name in your Zoom screen, we would love to see your full name so that we all know who is here. And when we get to breakout groups in a minute, we're going to ask you to open your camera, if that's possible. If it's not possible, I understand, but if it is possible, please do so that your smaller group will be able to see you. And in your small groups, share your name. We'll have about 10 minutes for group conversation. So we certainly want you to build a quick group, but we're asking you to share mostly your name and not get into a lot of introductions, and instead to jump into these two other group conversations. First, if we made sense of our social positions in front of our students, how might that impact the social, political, and cultural dynamics at AU? So how can we bring these to life with students? And then a question, do some of us bear greater risks than others in making those social positions visible, audible, explicit to our students? So we're going to ask you to engage in those. We're breaking you up into random groups this time. Literally, Zoom will randomize this for us. And so you'll be in small groups for about 10 minutes. My watch says that it's 10:04, so we will come back together just around 10:15, and we'll give you a small reminder. Please add on to what I just shared, Amara.
Let me do this. I am going to put in the chat this PowerPoint so that if anybody wants to take it with them into the breakout group, they have it. Second, I strongly encourage you in your breakout rooms to just share your first name. Please do not get into your program or what brought you into this. Just share your first name so that you can get into these two discussion points and build community off of those. So you're going to see the breakout room appear in front of you. And Samantha, when you get pulled into a breakout room, don't go in. I tried to exempt you and I couldn't do that.
No worries.
Hopefully everybody else sees the join breakout in front of them, and then they can just click to join. So Samantha, do you, I can't let this go. Do you see that you have the ability to go into a breakout room of your choice?
I see that I can go to breakout room 1.
That's it?
Yeah.
And
I'm going to pause the recording.
welcome back. How are those conversations? Were people being open, forthright, or did people skip their morning coffee and a bit more hesitant and shy? All right, we have just a few more groups to close their conversation. So as we're back, I'd like to invite you to use the chat. If there is a nugget of wisdom that you learned in that small breakout group that you think the rest of us should know about, could you please type that nugget of wisdom into the chat and spread that knowledge and wisdom around our Zoom room? If you think that that nugget needs to be attributed to somebody in the group, feel free to give props to the one who shared that knowledge. Otherwise, if it's group constructed knowledge, feel free to share that wisdom with the rest of us. Don't be shy. Y'all are better students. I know that. There we go. Thank you, Priya. In some disciplines, it may be harder for people to accept that discussing identity is an important part of the learning process. This was Bradley Knight's insight in speaking about teaching art classes. Thank you. That is definitely true. Any other wisdom that needs to be shared around for the great benefit of the whole room? Class did not come up quickly when a lot of other interesting things did. Thank you. Samantha, would you be willing to put your screen back up for where we picked up with the PowerPoint? We just discussed the tensions between whether sharing about ourselves is a form of power or not, our marginalized identities, and less about our privilege. I'm sorry, I was reading two quotes at the same time. Yeah. Yeah, I think that these are all excellent insights. You know, the joy in a faculty learning community is we don't make the expectation that one has the knowledge and then is able to disperse that to the others. It's us constructing this as we go. And so I really appreciate you all leaning in first thing in the morning to have these difficult conversations. But I think as an AU community, we do need to have them. Let's move to the screen right in front. Oh, thank you, Shatha. White male students tend to resist and feel defensive about conversations about racism. So it helps to make sure everyone understands that they will be supported regardless of identity. Excellent. And also helps that they be supported because of their identities. All right, so let me read this next quote out loud. This is also coming from Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, page 83. And this quote will lean into our part 2 of our agenda, where we named part 2 as academic discipline. Whoever makes the cultural standard makes the cultural hierarchy. The act of making a cultural standard and hierarchy is what creates cultural racism. When Kendi was referencing this quote in the book, it was in the context of better understanding these terms of race, racism and power, privilege, inequalities, and inequities. And he was making it very clear that the one who controls the cultural standards makes the cultural norms. This is where I find it very smooth and straightforward to talk with my students about the power of the one who gets to define and create and establish norms in our society. And that is where we get cultural racism. If we move to the next screen, we have some words that I'm sure are familiar to all of you. Racism, power, equality and equity, anti-racism, anti-racist, privilege. What I would like to know, since this is a session that is focusing on pedagogy, I'm curious to know if there's someone in the room who wants to jump off of mute and share, how do you teach one of these words to students in your own classes? Either racism or power or privilege or anti-racism or equity or equality. Choose one of these words and just share with the rest of us, how do you teach this? How do you describe this? How do you define this word in front of your students? And we might be able to learn from those of you who have brought these words or concepts into your class, how the rest of us could find a way to lean into bringing these words or concepts into our own instruction. Is there someone who's willing to jump off of mute? I don't have my gallery view up, so please don't worry about raising your hand. If you're willing to share what you would do or what you do often do in your class, please feel free to jump off of mute and share that with us.
Hi, Amara, it's Priya.
Hi, Priya.
Hi. So in relation to power, when we talk about that in the field of communication, particularly when we talk about it in terms of defining concepts such as, you know, who gets to shape a communications campaign, who gets to decide what is needed for a particular community, I'll tell my students, you know, often when we're talking about the developing world, those initiatives come from the outside in. And there are often assumptions made about what that community actually needs without a proper consultation of the community. It's like, you know, if the community is consulted, they're told to answer this question, not what do you need as a broad question, but more like, what do you need regarding infant child mortality, for example. And so, you know, I'll ask my students to think about, how do you think the community would define their biggest need if they were allowed to define it, as opposed to being told, this is your biggest need, what do you want us to do about it?
That's a great example. Thank you for that, Priya. Is there someone else in the room that has used one of these words in their instruction? How have you defined it or described it in the context of what you teach?
Hi, Amara and Sarah. This is Trina.
Hi, Trina.
I teach in our nutrition education program, and we often talk about the effects of inequality and inequity, and what are the differences there in populations who are living in areas that are termed food deserts and low nutrition. They have low nutritional value at their doorsteps, really, because they don't have access to foods that are high in nutrient content. And so if we were to say, well, you know what, let's just be fair across the board, is this fair across the board to provide every single person in a city nutritional food, or do we need to individualize nutrition? And this actually becomes much more complex, just because every individual needs individualized nutrition, and they learn that throughout our curriculum. And so we come back to this over and over. And by the end, it's very interesting to see the discussions that take place, and also how career paths are changed and who feels more, I want to say motivated, that's not the real
inclined
word.
Yeah,
yes, more inclined,
motivated, yeah,
to work with certain populations or certain programs and this and that. So these discussions, and they actually lead these discussions, it's fabulous. And I have learned a lot today. Thank you so much for this, because I think the way in which I'm creating the courses could totally be revamped so that this comes out more naturally from the students and many different aspects as well. So thank
excellent.
you.
No, thank you, Trina. Could we have one other example? We've got something great from SOC. We've got something from looking at health. Someone else want to jump in with how have you used one of these terms or phrases in your own class instruction?
I could mention, for racism, I teach a class on intercultural understanding, and part of the student body that we teach are international students in the International Accelerator Program at SPECS. Many of the students, one of the things that I do as a foundation is actually talk about history. You'd be surprised for students who are 18 or 19 years old that they don't sort of, they're not even aware about some of the things that we might take for granted. And so having at least I don't want to say a quick, but sort of a thorough sort of discussion about sort of the nature and sort of the consequences of racism in the United States is very important, because people aren't aware of these things. So, I mean, this deals with race obliquely, but there were some students who didn't even know what the Holocaust is.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
in as much as that sort of Jews are not considered white or were not considered white or what have you at one time, and which we might find astonishing, but they're a function of their environment in terms of where they grew up.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, having these kinds of historical foundations, I think, is important, which isn't to take away from any the other things that other people were saying.
No, absolutely. I think that we all need to lean into our role as educators, right? We need to assess what our students know and then meet them there and continue their growth. It's not the time to be frustrated that students don't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
They're coming into our classrooms to learn. And I think you hit a great reality that these concepts are very broad and large. They are definitely nuanced to our own experiences and lived experiences. And so when we're teaching these concepts, we have to provide relevant examples. We have to draw our students in, and we have to be very clear and explicit about how these terms show up in our respective disciplines. Samantha, could you move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Why don't you start here and then I'll pick up after your 1 minute. I'm giving you 1 minute.
Perfect. So I think like that is the point though, like our systems were designed to get the results they get. Our disciplines were designed with white hegemonic power in mind. And so I work in the education space. And I want to just highlight the history of American education is founded on a system that was first private education for those who are wealthy and elite for men. We then created a public education system that was meant to sort and classify and group students. And we created an education system where the teacher was seen as the expert. And that is the education system we live within currently today in the pre-K to 12 space. And I would contend in many ways in the higher ed space as well. And so I feel like it's becoming of me as a faculty member who sits in front of students who want to lead school districts, who want to lead nonprofits, to ensure that we understand the history of our education discipline so that we can figure out what the future is. And also so that we can really talk about the white-centered, male-centered way that our disciplines, many of our disciplines, not all of our disciplines, were created. Because I know there are those of us who operate in disciplines that are not actually about whites or about men. They are founded in much more anti-racist beliefs. But I feel like it's my responsibility as a faculty member to constantly question how I came to even be in the position that I'm in and how the discipline came to prioritize what it's prioritizing and to bring those conversations to the surface. And so we want to talk about the disciplines we each operate within, knowing that we each operate within different disciplines. So I'm going to kick it back to you, Amara, before we break out into some groups again.
So this next slide is how I come to understanding cultural racism in my work with teacher education. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is, her image is here in the lower right-hand corner, talks about culturally relevant instruction. And she also helps to break down this notion of the achievement gap. And so I find this comic representation here, this graphic representation, really helpful to show my students how they can better understand power, privilege, and racism having an influence on the achievement gap. So this is just one way of Samantha and I showing how our own understanding of our disciplines helps us to initiate conversations on racism, power, and privilege from a discipline-specific context. So this is what we'd like to do. We're going to put you in a different breakout group with different people. Again, only share your first name, all right? Time is of the essence. And what I'd like you to discuss are the words that are in bold, italicized on the screen. Discuss how you can locate issues of racism, power, privilege, and equities or inequities masked within your academic disciplines. We don't need you to discuss what are those issues. Please don't get into where is racism showing up in chemistry or where inequity is showing up in the School of Ed, but rather how do you locate those issues? I think that's where we can have some really great conversations across this university group. And then secondly, discuss what instructional strategies can be used to make these issues explicit to students and your academic community. You heard Priya, Trina, Craig, myself, Samantha describe some of the instructional strategies that we use. So in your group, talk about instructional strategies and talk about how to locate these issues within our academic disciplines, all right? And if we time this correctly, we're gonna give you another 10 minutes in this group and then pull you back in before we have to close out at 10:45.